Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 13, Esther's Narrative. We held many consultations about what Richard was to be, first without Mr. Jarndyce, as he had requested, and afterwards with him, but it was a long time before we seemed to make any progress. Richard said he was ready for anything. When Mr. Jarndyce doubted whether he might not already be too old to enter the Navy, Richard said he had thought of that, and perhaps he was. When Mr. Jarndyce asked him what he thought of the army, Richard said he had thought of that too, and it wasn't a bad idea. When Mr. Jarndyce advised him to try and decide within himself whether his old preference for the sea was an ordinary boyish inclination or a strong impulse, Richard answered, well, he really had tried very often, and he couldn't make out. How much of this indecision of character, Mr. Jarndyce said to me, is changeable on the incomprehensible heap of uncertainty and procrastination on which he has been thrown from his birth? I don't pretend to say, but that Chancery, among its other sins, is responsible for some of it. I can plainly see it has engendered, or confined in him, a habit of putting off and trusting to this, that the other chance, without knowing what chance, and dismissing everything as unsettled, uncertain, and confused. The character of much older and steadier people may be even changed by the circumstances surrounding them. It would be too much to expect that a boy's, in its formation, should be the subject of such influences and escape them. I felt this to be true, though, if I may venture to mention that I thought it much to be regretted that Richard's education had not counteracted these influences or directed his character. He had been 8 years at a public school, and had learnt, I understand, to make Latin verses of several sorts in the most admirable manner, but I had never heard that it had been anybody's business to find out what his natural bent was, or where his failings lay, or to adapt any kind of knowledge to him. I haven't the least idea, said Richard, musing, what I had better be, except that I am quite sure I don't want to go into the church. It's a toss-up. You have no inclination in Mr. Kenge's way, suggested Mr. Jarndyce. I don't know, sir, replied Richard. Surgeon, suggested Mr. Jarndyce. That's the thing, sir, cried Richard. I doubt if he had ever once thought of it before. That's the thing, sir, repeated Richard with the greatest enthusiasm. We have got it at last. MRCS. He was not to be laughed out of it, though he laughed at it heartily. He said he had chosen his profession, and the more he thought of it, the more he felt that his destiny was clear. The art of healing was the art of all others to him, mistrusting that he only came to this conclusion because, having never had much chance of finding out for himself what he was fitted for, and having never been guided to the discovery, he was taken by the newest idea, and was glad to get rid of the trouble of consideration. I wondered whether the Latin verses often ended in this, or whether Richard's was a solitary case. Mr. Jarndyce took great pains to talk with him seriously, and put it in his good sense not to deceive himself in so important a matter. Richard was a little grave after these interviews, but invariably told Ada and me that it was all right, and then began to talk about something else. By heaven, cried Mr. Boythorn, who interested himself strongly in the subject. I rejoice to find a young gentleman of spirit and gallantry devoting himself to that noble profession. The more spirit there is in it, the better for mankind, and the worse for these mercenary taskmasters, the low tricksters who delight in putting the illustrious art at a disadvantage in the world. By all that is base and decipherable, cried Mr. Boythorn, the treatment of surgeons aboard ship is such that I would submit the legs, both legs, of every member of the Admiralty Board to a compound fracture and render it a transportable offence in any qualified practitioner to set them if the system were not wholly changed in 48 hours. He wound up this vehement declaration by looking round upon us with a most agreeable smile and suddenly thundering, ha, 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 over and over again. As Richard still continued to say that he was fixed on his choice after repeated periods for consideration had been recommended by Mr. Jarndyce and had expired, he still continued to assuage Ada and me in the same final manner, and it was all right. It became advisable to take Mr. Kenge into counsel. Mr. Kenge, therefore, came down to dinner one day, and leaned back in his chair, and turned his eyeglasses over and over, and spoke in a sonorous voice, and did exactly what I remembered to have seen him do when I was a little girl. "Ah," said Mr. Kenge. "Yes, well, a very good profession, Mr. Jarndyce, a very good profession. Of course, the study and preparation requires to be diligently pursued," observed my guardian, with a glance at Richard. "Oh, no doubt," said Mr. Kenge, "diligently. And Mr. Richard Carstone, who has so meritoriously acquitted himself in the, shall I say, the classic shades in which his youth had been passed, will no doubt apply the habits, if not the principles in practice, of versification in that tongue in which a poet was said, unless I mistake, to be born, not made, to the more eminently practical field of action on which he enters. You may rely upon it," said Richard in his offhand manner, "that I shall go at it and do my best." "Very well, Mr. Jarndyce," said Mr. Kenge, greatly nodding his head. "Really, when we are assured by Mr. Richard that he means to go at it and do his best, I would submit to you that we have only to inquire into the best mode of carrying out the object of his ambition. Now, with reference to placing Mr. Richard with some sufficiently eminent practitioner, is there any one in view at present?" "No one, Rick, I should think," said my guardian. "No one, sir," said Richard. "Quite so," observed Mr. Kenge. "As the situation now, is there any particular feeling on that head?" "I should like a little variety," said Richard. "I mean a good range of experience." "Very requisite, no doubt," returned Mr. Kenge. "I think this may be easily arranged. Mr. Jarndyce, we have only, in the first place, to discover a sufficiently eligible practitioner, and as soon as we make our want known, our only difficulty will be in the selection of one from a large number. We have only, in the second place, to observe those little formalities which are rendered necessary in our time of life and our being under the guardianship of the court. Is it a coincidence, said Mr. Kenge, that I have a cousin in the medical profession? He might be deemed eligible. It is a coincidence, said Mr. Kenge, that I have a cousin in the medical profession. He might be deemed eligible by you, and might be disposed to respond to this proposal. I can answer for him a little if you look. I can answer for him a little as I can answer for him as little as for you, but he might. It was arranged that Mr. Kenge should see his cousin, and as Mr. Jarndyce had before proposed to take us to London for a few weeks, it was settled next day that we should make our visit at once and combine Richard's business with it. Mr. Boythorn leaving us within a week, we took up our abode at a cheerful lodging near Oxford Street, over an upholsterer's shop. London was a great wonder to us, and we were out 4 hours and hours at a time, seeing the sights, which appeared to be less capable of exhaustion than we were. We made the round of the principal theatres too, and with great delight, and saw all the plays that were worth seeing. I mention this because it was at the theatre that I began to make be made uncomfortable again by Mr. Guppy. I was sitting in front of the box one night with Ada, and Richard was in the place he liked best, behind Ada's chair, when, happening to look down into the pit, I saw Mr. Guppy with his hair flattened down upon his head, and woe depicted on his face, looking up at me. I felt all through the performance that he never looked at the actors, but constantly looked at me, and always with a careful, prepared expression of the deepest misery and profoundest dejection. It quite spoiled my pleasure for that night, because it was so very embarrassing and so very ridiculous. But from that time forth, we never went to the play without seeing Mr. Guppy in the pit, always with his hair straight and flat, his shirt collar turned down, and a general feebleness about him. I really cannot express how uneasy this made me. If he would only have brushed up his hair or turned up his collar, it would have been bad enough. But to know that absurd figure was always gazing at me, and always in that demonstrative state of despondency, put such a constraint upon me that I did not like to laugh at the play, or to cry at it, or to move, or to speak. I seemed able to do nothing naturally. While we were making this round of gaieties, in which Mr. Guppy so extraordinarily participated, the business which had helped to bring so which had helped to bring us to town, was not neglected. Mr. Kenge's cousin was a Mr. Bayham Badger, who had a good practice at Chelsea and attended a large public institution besides. He was quite willing to receive Richard into his house and to superintend his studies. And as it seemed that those could be pursued advantageously under Mr. Badger's roof, and Mr. Badger liked Richard, and as Richard said he liked Mr. Badger well enough, an agreement was made, the Lord Chancellor's consent was obtained, and it was all settled. On the day when matters were concluded between Richard and Mr. Badger, we were all under engagement to dine at Mr. Badger's house. We were to be merely a family party, Mrs. Badger's note said, and we found no lady there but Mrs. Badger herself. She was a lady about 50, I should think, youthfully dressed, and of a very fine complexion. If I add that she rouged a little, I do not mean that there was any harm in it. Mr. Bayham Badger himself was a pink, fresh-faced, crisp-looking gentleman with a weak voice, white teeth, light hair, and surprised eyes, some years younger, I should say, than Mrs. Bayham Badger. He admired her exceedingly, but principally, and to begin with, on the curious grounds, as it seemed to us, of her having had 3 husbands. We had barely taken our seats when he said to Mr. Jarndyce, quite triumphantly, "You would indeed suppose that I am Mrs. Bayham Badger's third." "Indeed," said Mr. Jarndyce. "Her third," said Mr. Badger. "Mrs. Bayham Badger has not the appearance, Mrs. Summerson, of a lady who has had 2 former husbands." I said, "Not at all." "And most remarkable men," said Mr. Badger, in a tone of confidence. "Captain Swooser, of the Royal Navy, who was Mrs. Badger's first husband, was a very distinguished officer indeed. The name of Professor Dingo, my immediate predecessor, is one of European reputation." Dinner was announced, and we went downstairs. It was a very genteel entertainment, very handsomely served, but the captain and the professor still ran in Mrs. Badger's head, and as Ada and I had the honor of being under his particular care, we had the full benefit of them. I observed that evening, as I had observed for some days, that Ada and Richard were more than ever attached to each other's society, which was but natural, seeing that they were going to be separated so soon. I was therefore not very much surprised when we got home, and Ada and I retired upstairs to find Ada more silent than usual, though I was not quite prepared for her coming into my arms and beginning to speak to me, with her face hidden. "My dear Esther," murmured Ada, "I have a great secret to tell you." "What is it, Ada?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess." "Shall I try to guess?" said I. "Oh, no, don't, pray don't," cried Ada, very much startled by the idea of my doing so. "Now I wonder who it can be about," said I, pretending to consider. "It's about," said Ada in a whisper, "it's about my cousin Richard." "Well, my own," I said, kissing her bright hair, which was all I could see. "And what about him?" "Oh, Esther, you would never guess. He says, I know it's very foolish, we are both so young, but he says," with a burst of tears, "that he loves me dearly, Esther." "Does he indeed?" said I. "I never heard of such a thing. Why, my pet of pets, I could have told you that weeks and weeks ago, my darling. What a goose you must take me for. Your cousin Richard has been loving you as plainly as he could for I don't know how long. And yet you never said a word about it," cried Ada, kissing me. "No, my love," I said. "I waited to be told." "But now I have told you, you don't think it wrong of me, do you?" returned Ada. I said, "No," very freely. "And now," said I know the worst of it." "Oh, that's not quite the worst of it, Esther dear," cried Ada, holding me tighter and laying down her face again upon my breast. "Why, you never mean to say—" I was beginning in joke, but Ada, looking up and smiling through her tears, cried, "Yes, I do. You know I do," and then sobbed out, "With all my heart I do, with all my whole heart, Esther." I told her, laughing, why I had known that too, just as well as I had known the other. And we sat before the fire, and I had all the talking to myself for a little while, though there was not much of it, and Ada was soon quiet and happy. "Do you think my cousin John knows dear Dame Durden?" she asked. Unless my cousin John is blind, my pet, said I. I should think my cousin John knows pretty well as much as we know. We want to speak to him before Richard goes, said Ada timidly, and we wanted you to advise us and tell him so. Perhaps you wouldn't mind Richard's coming in, Dame Durden. Oh, Richard is outside, is he, my dear? Said I. I am not quite certain, returned Ada, but I think he is waiting at the door. There he was, of course. They brought a chair on either side of me and put me between them, and really seemed to have fallen in love with me instead of one another. They were so confiding and so trustful and so fond of me. They went on in their own wild way for a little while. I never stopped them. I enjoyed it too much myself. And then we gradually fell to considering how young they were, and how there must be a lapse of several years before this early love could come to anything, and how it could come to happiness only if it were real and lasting, and inspired them with a steady resolution to do their duty to each other with constancy, fortitude, and perseverance, each always for the other's sake. Well, Richard said that he would work his fingers to the bone for Ada, and Ada said that she would work her fingers to the bone for Richard, and they called me all sorts of endearing and sensible names, and we sat there advising and talking half the night. Finally, before we parted, I gave them my promise to speak to their cousin John tomorrow. So when tomorrow came, I went to my guardian after breakfast, in the room that was our town substitute for the growlery, and told him that I had it in trust to tell him something. Well, little woman, he said, shutting up his book, if you have accepted the trust, there can be no harm in it. I hope not, guardian, said I. I can guarantee that there is no secrecy in it, for it only happened yesterday. Aye? And what is it, Esther? Guardian, said I, you remember the happy night when we first came down to Bleak House, when Ada was singing in the dark room? Because Ada and Richard have fallen in love, and have told each other so. Already? Cried my guardian, quite astonished. Yes, said I, and to tell you the truth, guardian, I rather expected it. The deuce you did, said he. He sat considering for a minute or two with his smile, at once so handsome and so kind, upon his changing face, and then requested me to let them know that he wished to see them. When they came, he encircled Ada with one arm, in his fatherly way, and addressed himself to Richard with a cheerful gravity. Rick, said Mr. Jarndyce, I am glad to have won your confidence. I hope to preserve it. When I contemplated these relations between us, 4 of which have so brightened my life, and so invested it with new interests and pleasures, I certainly did contemplate afar off the possibility of you and your pretty cousin here being in a mind to go through life together. I saw and do see many reasons to make it desirable, but that was afar off, Rick, afar off. We look afar off, sir, returned Richard. Well, said Mr. Jarndyce, that's rational. Now hear me, my dears. I might tell you that you don't know your own minds yet, that 1,000 things may happen to divert you from one another, that it is well this chain of flowers you have taken up so easily broken, or it might become a chain of lead, but I will not do that. Such wisdom will come soon enough, I dare say. If it is to come at all, I will assume that a few years hence you will be in your hearts to one another what you are today. All I say before speaking to you, according to that assumption, is, if you do change, don't be ashamed still to confide in me, for there will be nothing monstrous or uncommon in it. I am only your friend and distant kinsman. I have no power over you whatever, but I wish and hope to retain your confidence, if I do nothing to forfeit it. I am very sure, sir, returned Richard, that I speak for Ada too, when I say that you have the strongest power over us both, rooted in respect, gratitude, and affection. Dear cousin John, said Ada on his shoulder, my father's place can never be empty again. All the love and duty I could ever have rendered to him is transferred to you. Come, said Mr. Jarndyce. Now for our assumption. Now we lift our eyes up and look hopefully to the distance. Rick, the world is before you, and it is most probable that as you enter it, so it will receive you. Trust in nothing but Providence and your own efforts. Constancy in love is a good thing, but it means nothing and is nothing without constancy in every kind of effort. If you had the abilities Of all the great men, past and present, you could do nothing well without sincerely meaning it and setting about it. If you entertain the supposition that any real success in great things or in small ever was or could be, ever will or can be, wrested from the fortune by fits and starts, leave that wrong idea here, or leave your cousin Ada here. I will leave it here, sir, replied Richard, smiling. If I brought it here just now, but I hope I did not, and will work my way on my cousin Ada in the hopeful distance. Right, said Mr. Jarndyce. If you are not to make her happy, why should you pursue her? I wouldn't make her unhappy. No, not even for her love, retorted Richard proudly. Well said, cried Mr. Jarndyce. That's well said. She remains here, in her home, with me. Love her, Rick, in your active life no less than in her home when you revisit it, and all will go well. Otherwise, all will go ill. That's the end of my preaching. I think you and Ada had better take a walk. Ada tenderly embraced him, and Richard heartily shook hands with him. And then the cousins went out of the room, looking back again directly, though to say that they would wait for me. The door stood open, and we both followed them with our eyes as they passed down the adjoining room, in which the sun was shining, and out to its farthest end. Richard, with his head bent and her hand drawn through its arm, was talking to her very earnestly, and she looked up in his face, listening, and seemed to see nothing else. So young, so beautiful, so full of hope and promise, they went on lightly through sunlight, as their own happy thoughts might then be traversing the years to come, and making them all years of brightness. So they passed away into shadow, and were gone. It was only a burst of light that had been so radiant. The room darkened as they were out, and the sun was clouded over. Am I right, Esther? Said my guardian when they were gone. Rick may gain out of this the quality he wants at the core of so much that is good, said Mr. Jarndyce, shaking his head. I have said nothing to Ada, Esther. She has her friend and counselor always near, and he laid his hand lovingly upon my head. I could not help showing that I was a little moved, though I did all I could to conceal it. Tut, tut, said he, but we must take care, too, that our little woman's life is not all consumed in the care of others. Care, my dear guardian? I believe I am the happiest creature in the world. I believe so, too, said he, but someone may find out, what Esther never will, that the little woman is to be held in remembrance above all other people. I have omitted to mention, in its place, that there was someone else at the family dinner party. It was not a lady, it was a gentleman. It was a gentleman of dark complexion, a young surgeon. He was rather reserved, but I thought him very sensible and agreeable. At least Ada asked me if I did not, and I said yes. And that is the end of chapter 13.